Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I'm going to see me doing a little bit of watercolor painting and I'm going to talk a little bit about paper, watercolor paper. Now this video, of course, everybody's welcome to watch it, but I would say I'm aiming the video at people who are new to watercolor or maybe thinking about trying some watercolor painting. So if you're already experienced with this medium, I doubt that there's much in this video that's going to be new information for you. So watercolor paper, there's a number of different things to consider when choosing a paper to use. The first thing, and the one that probably has the biggest effect on how your final painting looks, is the surface texture of the paper. So you can get a hot press paper, which is a very smooth surface. You can get cold pressed. There's some texture there, but not a huge amount. Just to confuse things, cold pressed paper is also sometimes called NOT, N-O-T. And then you also, it depends on the brand, but some brands will also produce rough paper, which, you know, as the name suggests, has a rough surface texture. Of the three, the one that's often recommended for beginners is probably a cold pressed paper. It's probably the easiest one to use. The hot pressed and the rough are more for sort of special circumstances, if you like. So the hot pressed paper is good for fine details, and the rough paper is probably more suited to a very loose, somewhat abstract or impressionistic approach to painting. The paper that you can see me using at the moment is a hot press paper, so it's a smooth paper. But this example on screen at the moment, this was done on a rough paper. And I've expanded up a little section of the painting on the right, and I think you can probably see some of the texture on the paper. It is a very pronounced texture. And then this example is again going back to a hot press paper. For me, I'm happy enough to try all of them. I don't have any particular preference, but I can see that hot press paper is probably a little bit trickier to work with if you're new to watercolor painting. It's a little bit more difficult to control the way the wet paint flows across the surface, especially when you're painting wet and wet. But you can get some interesting effects with the hot press paper. The other thing, the hot press paper, because there's no surface texture, when you scan it, let's say, for example, you want to create some prints of your paintings, or maybe you want to put the image onto greeting cards or something like that. The hot press paper, when you scan it, it's just the image. Whereas with the rough paper or even the cold press paper, you're going to get that texture coming through in the final scan of the painting. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but it is something to consider as well. Other things worth considering then are the weight of the paper. Anything below 140 pounds, about 300 grams per square meter, you're probably going to have to pre-soak the paper. And that's a whole process. Anything above that, those numbers, you probably don't have to stretch the paper in any way. Another thing to consider then is what's the paper made of? In general, high quality watercolor paper is 100% cotton. And again, that's what is recommended for most beginners. You can buy cheaper paper that's made from wood pulp. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as cellulose paper. It can work, but not as well as the 100% cotton paper. You can also get mixtures, so it's maybe like 50-50 wood pulp and cotton and so on. But if you can, I would definitely recommend getting 100% cotton paper. Another thing to consider then is sizing. Now, the thing about sizing is they don't always tell you this information. Sometimes you have to go hunting for it on the company's website. But basically sizing, it could be internally sized or externally sized or both. It makes a small difference. So the internally sized paper is, when you put the paint onto it, the paint is more likely to soak into the paper a little bit more. Whereas with externally sized paper, the paint sort of sits on the surface a little bit more. This means you can maybe work with it a little bit more if you're doing wet in wet painting. Some people also say that because the pigment doesn't sink into the paper just as much, that once it's dried, the final painting looks brighter because the pigment stays closer to the surface. There might be some truth in that, but it's a very subtle difference. It's not a huge difference usually. But it is, again, something worth considering. A final point maybe is also for anyone who's vegan. Sizing some companies still use animal products for sizing. Many of them don't. They'll use chemical sizing or plant-based sizing. But again, it might be something that you want to consider and think about. And unfortunately, again, it's not something that's put out in the open. You have to kind of go and look at the website and try and figure out which companies are vegan friendly, which ones are not. The paper that I use, Hahnemühle, is, I'm going to say always vegan friendly, but double check that. They've been using, I think, plant-based sizing, for many years, since the 1960s, I think. But again, something worth considering. On my website, I have a short blog article which goes into slightly more detail about, the choices for watercolor paper. Anybody who's interested, there's a link in the description box below. Other than that, thank you for watching and listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.